This is great. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for tonight and hopefully for the rest of the semester. And it really is impending now, isn't it? Before I would say it, you'd be like, is he going to say it again? Yeah, I'm going to say it. And you're also like, Will, what's going to happen? We don't know. But when it does happen, whatever it is, we'll know history better than we did if it had just happened a couple days before. That's how fortunate we are. Yeah, today's lecture is we're going to continue on with the New Deal. Last time we talked about the 1932 election. We talked about FDR winning huge and basically how that election went down. For those of you guys who remember, like we think about FDR as this amazing president who showed up, had a plan, like first 100 days. But as I told you, the interesting thing is that FDR, honestly, he didn't have much of a formalized plan. He promised a New Deal. And he promised to end prohibition. So did the Democrats. They did that with ferocity. That's where we got the 21st Amendment. Not long after he took office in '33, Congress, of course, and then the states. So you get all that, but the New Deal was really a plan that was an idea, and he hands it all over to experts. And that's one of the points I made last time. I just want to reiterate: when you look at people that are in politics, I think sometimes you see that the ones that succeed pretty well surround themselves with intelligent people, regardless of their politics. Good ideas, as I've been trying to impart to you the whole time, good ideas don't join political parties, right? Good ideas and bad ideas, they are just that. None of the party has ever had a monopoly on good or bad. Now, have some at moments in history had pretty, not monopoly, but like a oligopoly or monopoly or something like that? Oh yeah, absolutely. Just ask the Southern Democrats just before the Civil War. Definitely not a monopoly, but dang, they cornered the market on bad ideas. So all that's to say, FDR comes in, brings the New Deal, and calls Congress to do a special session. You now have a moment where these smart folks are going to begin pitching their ideas, working with one another, and this is what's going to take shape. We already talked about the banking regulations that were passed in the last lecture. For those of you guys who haven't seen it yet, that involves basically the bank closing. So they shut down the banks because banking had ceased in like half the states in the United States because insecurity. People had put money in there, but there was no wall between banks that kept your money and lent it out for housing loans and banks that took your money and dumped it into the stock market. So people didn't trust them. People lost their deposits. So one of the first things that FDR does is he comes in and basically says, we're shutting down every bank. We're going to investigate them. If they're sound, we'll open them back up. And if not, then we won't. I am so glad that this is the review. Whoops. All right, so there we go. Now we're recording. Welcome to History 2020. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today. And hopefully for the rest of the semester. If you don't know why I'm laughing, don't worry about it. Everything is fine. So anyway, to review, we wrapped up with the banking regulations in the New Deal and the changes that had gone on there. The fact that they had shut down the banks, only allowed ones that seemed to be stable to reopen. They implemented the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to give people security. So the government said these are safe banks, and they said if they don't work out, we'll cover you. And then with Glass-Steagall, the last thing that's passed this first year is a separation between commercial banks and banks that invest in in the stock market, right? So that's a separation. So that's the way he tries to regain and rebuild the relationship with banking. Does that all make sense? Cool. You're like, he only talked for like a minute, and then he said, does that all make sense? Moving on. Now we're going to get to labor, because this is a fundamental problem. All right. You may recall that I said the high point, unemployment is 25%. 25% of the population. Some cities, particularly like the Rust Belt cities we call them today, but like the ones where there is manufacturing going on and kind of older technologies. I mean, Toledo is like 80% unemployment. And don't get me wrong, some industries continue to do well in the Depression, like petroleum does fairly well, some newer technologies, but really the big, large commercial firms that had formed out that hired so many people, they get hit. So here's the issue. You have essentially companies that want to sell goods, but they can't because nobody's going to buy them. So in order for people to buy them, they have to get jobs. But companies aren't hiring because they don't have anyone to sell their goods to. So it becomes at some point kind of a cyclical motion, right? I mean, it builds on itself. And you still have mega wealthy people. Don't get me wrong. I mean, people stay rich throughout this depression. It's not like the money, it's not like all the money goes away. All the money that people thought they had in stocks went away, but it's never really there, you know? So don't forget that. Beanie Babies, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, so the issue is, how do you get people back to work? How do you deal with this? And what you've got to remember is this isn't a moment like now. A minimum wage is not a thing. So what this means is with no minimum wage, with no regulations on workers, the age, I mean, we're talking children up to the day you die for a lot of people are going to work. You have no limits on the work week. So when you look at the way that the regulations get put in the New Deal, a lot of people don't think about them in the context of exactly what was the problem they were trying to solve. You know, a lot of people now look at it and they're like, oh, it was just, you know, liberals trying to blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, you know, don't get me wrong. There are like very strong tendencies towards, you know, what would be considered the left in terms of workers' rights and all of this. But at the core of it, you shouldn't miss that this is a problem that they're trying to solve within a market. So as long as you have a huge supply of unemployed workers, you're going to have, and you have almost no demand for it. If you do get hired and there's no minimum wage, you'll work for anything. And if you'll work for anything, that doesn't give you any buying power to then start getting things going again. So how do you solve this problem? And that is really central to this from an economic perspective. In other perspectives, we talked about, you know, it's been a running theme about how the New Deal and the Depression, actually, not just the New Deal, but the Depression is a crisis of masculinity. How notions of like what a man should do at this time, you work, if you work hard, you'll do fine. You've got, you know, a past behind that where you've never had anything like the Great Depression. Things have happened, 1893 Depression for sure. You had downturns, but things picked back up fairly, you know, not like right afterwards, but certainly nothing like this where you have over a decade of just absolute depression. So people have to accommodate their notions. They have to begin to understand this isn't my fault. That's one of the beauties of capitalism, is the idea that anything you do, that you get something, you did and you earned. Anything bad that happens, you also earned. It's amazing for building work ethic and for having strength in oneself. But so much is outside of your control that there are times when no matter what you do, you're simply not going to be able to get ahead. And the Depression is one of those times. And this is one of the reasons why when you look at what FDR is going to do, a lot of it is about getting people back to work, right? Works programs, even if it's not something the market wants, right? So we're going to see that he tries to hire folks to do public construction, art, all of these things to try to get people working again, get money in their pockets, but also to allow them to resume a normal life. Anybody here right now not going to work every day and going a little bit crazy? Anybody? Nobody? You were all crazy anyway. I don't go to work every day, and you know what I did? I turned my guest bedroom into a movie. That's how crazy I'm getting, right? I can't reach through the internet and pull a lever in a car factory. You know what I'm saying? So not working can make people feel bad, even if it's not just from an economic perspective. So that's where we are there. So when you get into this, you have really the banking reforms are a big part of this, but you also have to get other things under control. Prices, for example. And a lot of this is done in the context of supply and demand. So if you watch the Dust Bowl documentary already, you know that one of the ways that the government deals with this at a time when people are starving and do not have food is that the government establishes what's called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, in which the federal government purchases and then destroys acres and acres of crops and slaughters animals. And I don't know if you remember that sad story from the Dust Bowl documentary where they got the calf in there and he's like, can I just save the calf? And they're like, nope, they all got to die. That's you could imagine that's a weird way to deal with it. But you see in that, it's a market thing. We've got to get rid of the supply if we want the price to stabilize. By the way, you guys remember what the farmers in the Dust Bowl did the year after the Depression? Anybody? The genius part is that the year after the Depression essentially just blows the bottom out of the prices for what they grow. Farmers respond by farming up even more land, tilling it up, and trying to grow even more so they can sell more to make up for it. And it just makes everything even worse. So you guys follow what I'm saying? This is all because there's more, and people already weren't buying it. And on top of that, all you do is you exacerbate this environmental catastrophe that's happening out there anyway. So you can see how a lot of these things, once they set in an environment of an unchecked market, can really spiral and become a problem. This isn't necessarily a condemnation of markets. It's that sometimes logics kick in, right? Sometimes you have a spiraling effect, and it's worth remembering that keeping checks on and trying to keep away from letting that happen in the first place is not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea, historically. So let's talk about the work programs. You have the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is all part of the first year that FDR is in office. The goal of this is to hire people to go out and do work, public works, to hire men. It's all voluntary. You can go out, you get a job, working on projects that the market doesn't want. But this and the WPA, which is a different program later on, but all of these, the idea is don't just give people money, let them work for it. You guys know how that is, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, but something I worked for feels better to me than something I just got. And I think that is how we are as humans. That's in us. We care about our work. And so, the idea is you're building something, right? We're all in this together. We're building a project for the public. And if you go around the country, you'll see these things are still around. Parkways, parks.
In 1933, the chief concern of the American government was to break the back of a bad depression. Among the conditions to be remedied were two President Roosevelt recognized at once. Employment for hundreds of thousands of young men and war veterans was imperative. Havoc wrought by soil erosion had long since shown the necessity of the immediate restoration, conservation, and further development of the country's natural resources. As one solution for both problems, the organization and work of the Civilian Conservation Corps was undertaken. And in 2 years, through this unique plan, both problems were well on their way toward solution as great aids to economic recovery. The saving of natural resources was conservation pure and simple. One important phase of the development of these resources was more than that. It was the making of a nationwide system of recreational areas, smaller, more numerous state parks, closer to the people, more easily accessible for their use, supplementing the magnificent national parks.
Stephen, wasn't the Blue Ridge Parkway was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, right? Yeah. If you've been on that, it's beautiful. But it's about public works. These are not things that a market would necessarily purchase, but by building something for everybody and putting people to work, that's the idea behind it. We can get people going. On top of that, you have, I don't know if any of you guys pay your own utilities in Tennessee, but you're about to find out the origins of the Tennessee Valley Authority, formed in 1933. The idea behind the TVA is we're going to essentially use government money. It's similar in some ways to what the Hoover Dam did, right? The idea is we'll create a work, we'll create energy, we'll create jobs. We will, with the TVA, it also has to do with like building the lakes to push these dams, these hydroelectric dams. And they undertake some pretty massive projects. Side note, my grandma, born in 1921 in the Appalachian Mountains, well, in the Shenandoah Valley. She got pregnant when she was 15 years old. And her baby daddy ran off, finally got a job. He got a job with the TVA. And he left my grandma. I mean, it wasn't my grandma then. That'd have been weird. But it was, a young 15-year-old girl who was pregnant. And that was the last time she ever saw him. 36. Took off. So the TVA took my grandmother's first husband. Actually, they were married before he left, and then he never came back. In those days, you could get away like that. It was just a different time. You just run off, be like, I'm going to build a dam, and then you never see him again. That's simpler times they were for, well, I don't know if that was simple. Anyway, she was married 5 times eventually, and she never told us about one of them. We didn't find out till she died, and she was like, ah. Anyway, let's get back to this. Think about these programs here, all right? You're putting people to work. That's an idea, right? You're not going to put everybody to work, but you can put some people to work. You can establish an opportunity for people to send money back to the areas they are, build public work programs that enhance people's lives. And on top of that, think about the TVA. It's building dams which are producing electricity. You remember we talked about the 20s and why the 20s, there's a consumer boom in the 20s? Why are you seeing the consumer boom? Anybody remember this?
Credit.
Well, yeah, you get consumer credit for sure, right? That's everybody follows Singer Sewing Machine's model on that. But what's the thing, right? Remember we looked at those ads where like the child's all excited about a refrigerator? That's I called garbage on that one. But you get that, you get washing machines, you get all these radios. What do they all need?
Electricity.
Yes, they need electricity. I know this because I recently didn't have electricity for 9 days, and none of the things worked. And I'm proud to say that I've got, although my washer and dryer might actually have been made in the 30s, everything else in here is at least the 90s and forward, and it all didn't work. You've got to have electricity. Think about all the things you buy that use electricity. Think about what buying would look like. Think about what your consumer purchase would look like if you didn't have electricity. And that's one of the big pushes behind electrification. When we bring these public work programs to these places, it will electrify. It will bring electricity to a lot of people, and this turns people into consumers. You could have all the money in the world sitting in your house. You ain't gonna buy a radio if you don't have a way to turn it on. So that's another part of the idea, increasing production there. Now, 36, FDR runs again. He's going to run 4 times. He's going to win all times. 36, he cleans shop. Like last time I was like, he destroyed in 32. 36, he cleans shop. Even Delaware, which is not that impressive of a state, honestly. I mean, even Delaware finally went from voting for Hoover in 32 to voting for FDR. Come on, guys, even Delaware, you know what I'm saying? Didn't Vermont, it stayed its own republic after the American Revolution for a little bit. So, whose side are you on there, buddy? Maine wasn't even a state till 1820. So what do you know? And New Hampshire, not even new. So those are the states that went for the opponent, Landon. By the way, whose name I didn't remember until I just looked at the map in front of me. That's how bad FDR destroyed that guy in 36. That he knocked him out of future generations' minds and memories. So, win's huge. I mean, this is one of the biggest wins in the history of the presidential election. And he comes back in, and after doing these programs that, remember, a lot of these programs are like, would have seemed insane in the 1880s, would have even seemed crazy in the 1920s after that push back towards the other direction with the do-nothing president, so-called. And now you're at a point where you have 32, the Democrats sweep, FDR comes into office, boom, huge government programs, running to see if they got approval, even bigger numbers in this election here. So FDR is feeling pretty strong. Only problem, Supreme Court. That's going to be an issue for him. So, the whole time that FDR is trying to pass this, he's got a court stacked with judges from the 1920s, several of them from the 1920s, most of them highly suspicious of government power. And you can imagine what they think about a lot of his programs. Just a second. Speaking of hydroelectric, I'm going to need to wet this whistle. You guys are like, he already needs to drink of water, and he's only been talking for 16 minutes on this lecture? Shh, that's right, I have. That's the problem. I didn't forget to push record. Anyway, so the Supreme Court, stacked with people who are not fine with FDR's resolutions. And you remember this goes way back. Remember the Supreme Court had overturned attempts to limit minors' work hours to like 60 hours a week, right? The Supreme Court had for a long time been a very conservative institution, thinking in the sense of like government power. And they start shooting down the provisions of FDR's New Deal. 1935, they get rid of the National Recovery Act, which I didn't really go over, but was an attempt to get business to voluntarily participate, increase wages in return for, the promise the government would, give them signs to show that they're helping and other things. With limited time, I'm not going to get too much into it. Just remember, that's not the National Rifle Association. It's a totally different NRA. But it gets shot down 5-4. And then the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which, guys, I can't believe this wasn't popular. I mean, just destroying crops and slaughtering animals and not feeding them to anybody. Terrible. But anyway, 36, it rules that the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is also unconstitutional. So FDR is looking at the numbers. He's looking at the charts. He's like, pretty sure even Delaware voted for me this year. And you guys know Delaware, it's not that good of a state, but it voted for me. And FDR basically says, I think this is the ball's in my court. So he looks at the Supreme Court and basically more or less there's 5 people. It's 9 people it's 9 people on the bench. 5 of them are pretty dedicatedly against the New Deal programs. And FDR, feeling kind of strong, says, how about this? You know, you guys are kind of old, so just going to appoint new members to the Supreme Court. We're just going to add some on there for every one of you guys who won't leave. We'll just add like 2 on for you guys. And he essentially proposes adding like 6 more members to the Supreme Court because he's like, well, I guess I'm losing in 5-4. But whenever there's 6 more people, all of which I picked and my people approved because I got Senate in my pocket, won't have that problem anymore. How many members of the Supreme Court does the Constitution say there will be? The Constitution doesn't say any. Right. Remember, that's the vagueness. That's the beauty of the Supreme Court. Remember, I could seriously, if there was a 15-year-old guy walking in front of my road, he's born in Montreal. He speaks no language whatsoever. He's got 3 legs for some reason, one of which he's not even using. That guy could be on the Supreme Court, right? Anybody, as long as the president appoints them and the Senate approves them, they're game. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no.
The idea was, because I know that the origin of the 9 was that that's supposedly the hardest number to get to agree on something, because it's an odd number and it's a large number, but not large enough for there to be a consensus.
Well, there had been as many as 10 before in the past. It was not a set number. At the Constitutional Convention, some people walk out of there convinced it will just be one person, right? So it's changed over time. And so basically, like, the 9 has been the agreed upon principle for a long time. But there's nothing permanent in that except for precedent and probably good sense, honestly, because we keep doing this. It's like the next guy's like, well, I'm adding 7. And the next person, and next thing we got a Supreme Court that's larger than the House of Representatives. No thanks. So this is the amazing thing. And this is, I don't care how popular you are. Sometimes there's like a danger in getting to believe your own hype. Sometimes there's a danger in people being like, well, the guy, they love him. Let him do whatever he wants to. And this is one of those moments where you really see a potential problem being stopped. Because when FDR is like, I'll just stack the bench probably, people are like, no. Nope. Even his own party's like, that's crazy, buddy. I don't know if you've heard, but there's a guy named Hitler just came into power a couple of years ago. He's been changing numbers around on things too, and it hasn't worked out real well. So I get that you're popular, but we're going to go by the Constitution. And they stop him. And this is a president at one of the highest levels of popularity of any U.S. president. This guy has given, the fireside chats. This guy's giving fireside chats where he's just, people love him. They have a relationship with him like no other. And his own party and the American people are like, nah, we like you, but you don't get to be a tyrant. And that's good. That's good. So he has to back down. But one of the reasons that he doesn't push it further also is that Justice Owen Roberts essentially comes around. And when he does this, it puts the court in his favor, and that is going to save probably a lot of the second New Deal programs that end up getting put into place that might have gotten shot down as well. So let's go over those, because these are the good ones. All right. You know I love saying this. You know how God himself only got one day off, and you guys think you deserve two? You guys know that? I love saying that just to remind you that a weekend's not a real thing. Okay, and I know that we've all had like hundreds of days off at this point, but you know, yeah, I know, Darby, I know. I'm at work right now. I'm at work. Okay, so don't look at me like that. All right, we're cutting that out. All right, I'm not gonna be all sassy in here on this green screen. Maybe I'll put that like to some. Anyway, okay, so I'm just in a room talking.
I vote blooper reel anyway.
Oh, you vote blooper reel? Yeah, there's a lot of that, and I destroyed it. You'll notice when this lecture posts, it'll be 4.5 minutes long. No, okay.
Also,
yeah.
With the taking of land and taking of the cattle, would that be covered under the Fifth Amendment as long as they justly compensate, or is that the right amendment? Fifth Amendment?
Right. Yeah, just compensation. Right. So yeah, that's eminent domain. Right. Yeah. So that's part of the. Remember, Fifth. Remember, that's the part of it. Stephen, I've got these hand gestures I can show you later. I'll cut this out, but the First Amendment is your freedom of expression. Second Amendment is a right to bear arms. We don't need to go from there. I hope none of your parents were in the room. That was just a way to remember something, not a sign of my attitude towards you, good people. But yeah, so just compensation. So the idea is that that the people were compensated for it, right? The government purchased it off of them. And then later on, what's going to happen is that the federal government's going to pay people not to farm land. Because this still goes on. So like you have land, and if every farmer farmed every bit of land they had, it would lead to a glut on the market. So the federal government actually pays people not to grow. So that's a good point. Absolutely, yeah. So you've got to work within the bounds of the Constitution, because even when ideas are like really good for the big picture, you know, somebody not just going to be okay with somebody taking their cattle and shooting them unless something's in it for them. So yeah, that was excellent. So back to the whole weekend thing. The weekend is created in what's called the Second New Deal. It's the only sequel that's better than the original. And here's how it goes down. In an earlier New Deal policy that later on got shot down by the Supreme Court, there was a small provision that was kind of passed by and overlooked, and it guaranteed workers the right to unionize without the company stopping them. You guys remember, this has gone back and forth, right? You guys remember the attempts to unionize in the Gilded Age? I mean, literally, like, you know, Rutherford B. Hayes during the strike in 1877 sends in the army, and they set up militias and like these artilleries in cities in case they do it again. You've got the strikes on the railways. I mean, just all this going down. And then things get better under Teddy Roosevelt. But then I told you, already right after World War I, a police strike by the police officers in Boston. The governor, Calvin Coolidge, sends in the militia to shoot down police officers who are complaining about their working conditions. So you've seen it go back hard the other way in the 20s. But in the 30s, essentially there's a push by the federal government to help encourage this. Now, if you think about this, this should make sense. Because one of the things I told you is that if left to a free market, employees are going trying to find work, and they will be paid as little as possible by the logic of the market. The idea of a union would be that we're not letting the market set prices by individually. But what we are saying is, as a group, here is how much we want to work. So that is the principle. So essentially endorsing unionization is a way to get wages up, which every little bit helps when you're trying to improve purchasing power, right? So that's one way to think about it in a market-based system. So in 1935, you get what's called the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act formalizes that right to organize. It establishes a board that will oversee this. And actually, Stephen's going to talk about this here in a second as a labor historian and someone who also works for a labor union. He's kind of the perfect guy to talk about it. He's a guy who studied the history, went to graduate school, and then now he's doing the thing he studied. A great example of someone who learns history and applies it. So we'll get to that. I'm already ready to introduce him, but we'll hold off. So the Wagner Act allows workers the right to unionize. 35, you also have the Social Security Act. Oh my God, the Social Security Act. Social Security, the thing that no one thinks about when they think about socialism, yet starts with pretty much the exact same word as socialism. Social Security. The thing that allows my dad to retire. The thing that allows a lot of people to retire. In fact, the thing that makes most Americans get to even imagine the concept that one day they might not have to work. Remember what I told you about? You're working at a place, there's no protections for you. This is Gilded Age. And in the 1920s, very limited protections. You get hurt, you're just fired. I mean, you got nothing. There's nothing to fall back on. That's why that World War I bonus that the bonus army wanted when they marched on Washington was such a big deal, right? It was something they had. And most people didn't have that. So when you get down to the Wagner Act, that secures people's opportunity to make a bit more money then. But Social Security creates the idea of retirement. Now, can anyone think about this from a market perspective, right? Again, about the problems of high unemployment, about the problems of supply and demand in the wage pool, and tell me why Social Security is a smart solution to the problem of high unemployment.
Because it narrows the pool of workers, the workforce.
Because it narrows the pool of the workforce. When people can drop out of the workforce, they will. And if they stop looking for work, if they give up their jobs, that opens up work for other people without those people losing their income. You see, a lot of people look at the New Deal as like some kind of a crazy socialist project. It is very much a series of solutions to the problems of the market, right? I mean, this is why I say when you look at what FDR and the New Dealers do, and I say like you could say they save capitalism, because the two that are rising at the time, fascism and communism, they're not talking like this. I mean, fascism to some degree, but it's terrifying. But with FDR, these are solutions within the bounds of still maintaining a market for things. Does that make sense? Cool. So you get that. And that's a big deal. And then in 38, you get the one, man. You get the one. You guys ready for a weekend? Who's ready for a weekend? Who's ready for a weekend? Because in 1938, the Fair Labor, and everybody just raised their hand. It's Tuesday night when I'm recording this, by the way. And none of you have been at school in years, as far as I know. Oh God. All right. Anyway, so weekends. All right. When we get to go places, they'll mean something again. 1938, Fair Labor and Standard Act. This is where you get, and it's not just that a weekend exists. This is where you get minimum wage. It's where you get, and let me just clarify, 1938, it's where you get the first federal laws against child labor. Up until 1930, up until my grandma was 17 years old, you could work as a child. And I gotta admit, I've always wondered like how pissed somebody was, like the person whose birthday it was, like their 16th birthday was like the day that got passed, and they were like, good news, we don't have to work anymore. And the guy's like, no. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe he cared about other people. That'd be sweet. So, restricts child labor, adds minimum wage, and overtime pay. That's how you do a 40-hour week. So think about this. Because this is another, again, if you think about it from a market perspective, it's brilliant. Just like Social Security is going to pull a lot of older Americans out of the labor pool, ending child labor is going to pull people out from the bottom end as well. That is going to reduce the unemployment rate. That is going to, but here's the problem. If you pull children out of the workforce, unlike Social Security, you have money coming in. You have a program to replace that. You don't have that with children, right? So the issue is you're going to lose the household income. That will be a problem if every person weren't guaranteed to make a certain amount. That's where minimum wage comes in. And on top of that, when you think about from the issue of unemployment, consider this. An 8-hour workday, 8 hours, as the time the slogan was, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for self-development, 8 hours for sleep, right? And I know it was an old time when people used to imagine they slept 8 hours. I slept 5 last night. I feel strong. So, but God bless anybody who wants the 8. But that was the slogan at the time. Now, consider what going from a 12-hour workday to an 8-hour workday does. If you've got a factory that runs all the time and you're working people 12-hour shifts, how many essentially shifts do you have in a day? 2. But if you cut it to an 8-hour workday, every factory that's working 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. Every factory running like that, you just increase the employment there by 50%. You follow me on this? This is one of the things that people miss. So much of the New Deal is done within the bounds of a market, explicitly to try to save a sense of the market. And it's done in really brilliant ways. And I'll say, you guys have heard me geek out on Frances Perkins before. I think she in this class is to me what Hamilton is in my History 2010 class. Just like so far ahead, like so forward thinking, so smart. Frances Perkins definitely not quite the jackass that Hamilton was. Honestly, she's pretty smart. She would observe people. I don't know if you guys remember this from the reading I assigned you before spring break, but she would look at men because she was like the first female member of the presidential cabinet, right? So she would like look at men and try to figure out, like, I don't know if you guys know this, but like we're kind of dumb, right? Like we've got tails, and she just figured out that that men would respect older women. They respected older women. Younger women, they're like, but older women reminded them of their moms and their grandmas. So she deliberately dressed like she was way older than she was to essentially evoke that. And that's like her observation. It's brilliant. But in doing this, she gets things done. And she's the one behind it. And as I said in the last class, when FDR said, I want you to be my labor secretary, this woman sitting in front of the chance to be the first ever female presidential cabinet member. And she says to him, are you going to follow the policies I want? Are we going to push for a 40-hour work week? Are we going to push for these policies? Because if not, and you appoint me, you're in for a world of trouble. You don't want to appoint me because I will be a problem if you're going to tell me you're going to do this and you don't do it. And FDR says he will. She does it under her terms, and then they get it done. So all of this happens. All of this changes the way people work, and it allows for a lot of organizing. I mean, already in 1935, with labor unions, you have the United Auto Workers forming. You have a huge sit-down strike that goes down, one of the legendary sit-down strikes. In 1936, it begins in Flint. The idea of this is, you guys remember how we even talked about this? Remember the Pullman strike and the people were picketing outside and they just sent in the military to shoot them up, right? Or I mean, that's like everything before 1901 with the anthracite coal strike, right? It's basically send in the military, shoot them down, put them back to work. These folks figured it out. In Flint, Michigan, they didn't go outside and stand in front of the factory. They just sat down in the factory and refused to leave. So like, good luck trying to run these machines with us here. And we know you'll kill us and shoot things at us, but we also know that you care about the machines we're near. So if instead of going out front, we sit near the machines, we know what you guys care about. And we'll shut it down. And they hold out for months. And this is a huge moment in the labor union. And guys, the people who worked in the labor movement, man, people who worked in those factories for a long time, made good money. And I think it's interesting that a lot of people are like, yeah, but unions sunk the American car industry. It's like, really? Because General Motors was like the most profitable company in the world for like over 3 decades. At the same time, they were paying those wages. And also, I don't know if you guys have ever had a General Motors vehicle, like a Chevrolet from somewhere between 1979 and like the mid 1990s. It's the same car. They didn't really innovate it that much. Like I had a 1981 Chevrolet Suburban with the same V8 motor that they put in cars in the 90s. Maybe what sunk the American automotive industry was they made the same motors over and over and over again while they bought up foreign models and foreign brands, because that was the logic of the time. And then they sapped them by not updating their capital. And eventually it all fell apart and they got rid of Saturn and they got, not the planet, they got rid of Saturn, they got rid of that factory around here, they got rid of Pontiac, and when they dumped them all, that's when they got more profitable again. Oh my God, yeah. So anyway, Awesome. Well, I think we're towards the end. Anybody got any questions?
Nowadays, could you remove Supreme Court judges? Like, the number 9 is, like, been set, but could it be realistically, like, set to 5?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that limits that.
It's within their power to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if you look at the powers of impeachment that are outlined in the Congress, the Supreme Court justices are subject to impeachment. They can be impeached and they can be removed from office through that process. The only members of the federal government who can't, like on the inside, is Congress, because both houses of Congress have their own process for removing their own members, right? So you could, if you were in the House, you could remove somebody from the House without the Senate having any say so, which is probably better, and you know, and vice versa with the Senate. Probably better overall because you got to work with those people every day. So yeah, but with the Supreme Court, they could be, and I think I've mentioned this in class before. There was one Supreme Court justice who was impeached by the House, was not thrown out. A guy named Samuel Chase, nicknamed Old Bacon Face. He was that's really his nickname, and very unfortunate nickname, or an awesome one because I remember him. But basically, it had to do with for those of you guys who were in 2010, it had to do with the Revolution of 1800, right? The switch from the Federalists running everything to the Democratic Republicans. And Chase had been appointed by the Federalists and remained absolutely dedicated to thwarting the Democratic Republicans. And so he was impeached. And after that, everyone's kind of been like, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe, you know, if you want to have something that's stable in a position where anybody could be removed, that's been the consensus. But it doesn't have to be. So, yeah, that's a great question, though. It is interesting because you're like 9 Supreme Court justices. It's like, yeah, kind of, you know, right now. Good question. Nobody?
You were about to ask a question before I accidentally distracted you with the typing.
No, you didn't distract me. Look, I distract myself. All right, you asked a question. All right, have you seen? There's a fly in here earlier, and I had to get it out of here before I could do this because I would not be able to pay attention. I'd be like looking at the fly, and I'm not a cat. I'm a person. But I don't want to hear it from you guys who were in that class where we had that. What was it? Was there a wasp in a class? Which one? Was it you guys in the wasp class? Yeah. Remember that? You guys were like, oh, I can't. You act like there was a bird of prey flying above you, and you were wounded in a desert. And what happened? I got it just like I got the fly. What's up? Anyway, this is not bragging about killing insects class. So,